So, have you ever been exploring different paths to understanding, maybe, reading philosophy or different approaches to well-being? And you get the sense that, well, that they're all hinting at something similar,
Uh-huh.
but the way they talk about it just leaves you a little, well, unclear on the actual differences.
Yeah, that's a really common experience, I think. It sort of speaks to how we as humans try to make sense of these like fundamental truths and sometimes end up with different maps of the same territory.
Exactly. And well, that's pretty much what we're diving into today. We've got our hands on a fascinating ancient text, the Mahadukakanda Sutta.
Which is roughly on the mass of suffering.
Right. And what's really interesting is that it recounts this conversation where some seekers were grappling with this exact issue, this apparent overlap between different teachings on um, core aspects of being human.
It really brings up that fundamental question, doesn't it? If various teachings seem to point to similar ideas, how do we truly distinguish the depth, the specifics of their understanding?
Right. So our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack this ancient back and forth. We want to get to grips with the nuances within these teachings.
Okay.
We're going to be zooming in on three key areas: what the text calls sensual pleasures, forms, and feelings.
hmm
And we'll look at what makes them attractive, what inherent downsides they might have, and crucially, what this text suggests is the path to finding freedom in relation to them.
And it's probably worth stressing, right, that our entire exploration today is rooted directly in excerpts from this ancient conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going straight to the source, so to speak.
Okay.
Okay, so let's set the scene a bit. We're near a place called Savathi, and some monks are visiting the dwelling place of other ascetics. They're just waiting for their alms round.
Yeah, it sounds like there was a fair bit of, intellectual exchange happening back then, people talking about these ideas.
It really does highlight a culture where philosophical inquiry and the pursuit of understanding were clearly valued.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And these other ascetics, they put a very direct question to the visiting monks. They basically say, look, we also teach about fully understanding sensual pleasures, forms, and feelings, just like your teacher, the Buddha.
Hmm.
So they ask, what's the real distinction here? What's unique or, special about your teachings?
Wow, yeah. That gets right to the core, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What differentiates genuine insight from perhaps a more superficial grasp of these fundamental human experiences?
Totally. And the monks have a pretty interesting reaction. They don't immediately say, oh, no, we're totally different, or yeah, you're right, it's all the same.
Right. What do they do?
Well, instead, they decide this is a question best directed to the Buddha himself. So after their alms round, they go back and tell him about the conversation.
Okay, that shows a commendable level of maybe intellectual honesty and a reliance on the depth of their teacher's wisdom to navigate these complex questions.
Exactly. And the Buddha's response, well, it isn't to immediately give an answer. Instead, he outlines a method, a way for the monks to question anyone who makes such claims.
Okay, like a framework.
Yeah. He instructs them to ask about the allure, the drawbacks, and the liberation in relation to these three things: sensual pleasures, forms, and feelings.
That structured approach is really insightful, isn't it? It moves beyond just agreeing on words, on terminology, and pushes for a much deeper exploration of actual understanding.
That's right. And the Buddha emphasizes that anyone who hasn't truly understood these three angles, the appeal, the downsides, and the way out well, they won't be able to give a satisfactory explanation.
Hmm.
He essentially says that only someone who's truly awakened, a Tathagata, or perhaps a well-trained disciple, will have that genuine insight.
It suggests that true understanding isn't just intellectual. It requires a profound, maybe even a lived realization of these aspects.
Okay, so let's dive into that first one. Sensual pleasures, or kama. What does the Buddha actually say draws us to them? What's the initial pull, the allure?
Well, the allure, according to the Buddha here, is rooted in our five senses.
Mhm.
It's the sights, sounds, smells, tastes, and touches that we find agreeable, enticing.
Okay.
These are the things that ignite our desires, our passions,
Mhm.
and the happiness and joy that spring from experiencing these pleasant sensations.
Right.
That's identified as the allure.
Right, that immediate sense of gratification.
Exactly.
It makes perfect sense. I mean, we all recognize that initial pleasure of a good meal or beautiful music or, a comforting touch.
Hmm.
But then the text shifts to the drawbacks, the adinava, and this is where it gets, well, quite detailed, doesn't it?
It really does.
Let's start with the downsides we experience in this life. What does the Buddha highlight there?
Okay, so the Buddha paints this really vivid picture of the struggles inherent in everyday life when it's driven by pursuing these sensual pleasures.
How so?
He talks about the constant need to acquire the means to enjoy them. Learning trades, working the land, farming, even engaging in government service, stuff like that.
Right. The grind.
Yeah, the grind. And in doing so,
Yeah.
people face all sorts of hardships. The discomfort of heat and cold, the annoyance of insects, the unpredictable weather, and just the persistent pangs of hunger and thirst.
So it's a life characterized by effort and endurance, really.
That's a good way to put it. And it's striking how relevant that still feels today, isn't it? That daily struggle to earn a living, so much of it tied to wanting those pleasant sensory experiences, being able to afford them, maintain a certain lifestyle.
Absolutely. And the text goes further, right? It talks about the pain when that effort doesn't pay off.
Exactly. Even with all that hard work, there's no guarantee of success. If your crops fail, or your business falters, or the opportunities just don't arise.
Then what?
Well, the result is distress, disappointment, maybe even despair, lamentation.
Mhm.
Text even mentions potential mental derangement. That joy promised by sensual pleasures can very quickly morph into suffering.
Oof. Yeah, that gap between what we hope for and what actually happens.
Yeah.
That unfulfilled longing. And then there's the worry about keeping what you have managed to get.
Precisely. The Buddha speaks of the anxiety and suffering that come with safeguarding possessions, the fear of losing them.
To whom?
To rulers, to thieves, to fire, flood, or even, interestingly, to people you dislike, like heirs you don't favor.
Well,
And the deep sorrow that follows if those losses do occur. It's described as a perpetual state of vigilance and potential heartache.
it makes you think about how even today, with insurance and security systems, that underlying anxiety about loss persists. It's just maybe directed at different things, digital assets, job security.
That's a great point. You work so hard to accumulate things, and then you're constantly on guard, afraid of losing them. It's like the pleasure comes with a built-in alarm system.
And then the text kind of escalates, doesn't it? It moves into conflict and violence, which is quite jarring.
It is, yeah. The Buddha points out that sensual desires are a major catalyst for arguments, fights, not just between individuals, but between entire groups.
Like who?
Kings fighting kings, merchants against merchants, priests, lay people, even within families and circles of friends. It all stems from these desires.
Wow.
And this can escalate to physical violence, even death, all stemming from desires for sensory gratification, for what others possess, or maybe for protecting one's own stuff.
It's sobering to consider how many conflicts, big and small, probably have these fundamental desires somewhere near their root.
And the text doesn't shy away from the most extreme consequences, like warfare.
Right. What does it say about that?
The description of warfare is particularly stark. Soldiers going into battle, facing the very real possibility of being wounded or killed by arrows, spears, swords.
And the driving force is often.
Well, often the desire for land, power, resources, which ultimately serve the pursuit of sensory experiences for the rulers or the group. The text also details the horrors of sieges, the constant threat of injury or death from projectiles, hot liquids, even impalement. Grim stuff.
Very grim. And if that wasn't enough, the text then delves into the motivations behind criminal activity.
Yes. Acts like breaking into homes, pillaging, robbery, even sexual assault are all listed as being fueled by sensual desires,
And the consequences.
capture, and the infliction of horrific punishments by the authorities. The text really doesn't hold back in describing various forms of torture and execution in graphic detail. It's quite brutal.
It's a brutal reminder, yeah, of the extreme measures people might resort to in their pursuit of sensual gratification and the severe repercussions that can follow. And these drawbacks aren't just limited to this lifetime, are they, according to the text?
That's right. The Buddha explains that engaging in harmful actions, bodily, verbal, and mental misconduct, when they're driven by these sensual desires, leads to rebirth in unhappy realms. Specifically, hell is mentioned.
So the consequences extend beyond our immediate experience.
Exactly.
Okay. So after laying out this, really extensive list of what attracts us to sensual pleasures and all the potential pretty severe downsides, the Buddha then defines what it means to be liberated from them. What is that liberation, the nissarana?
Liberation is defined quite clearly. It's the complete removal and abandonment of craving, the utter cessation of desire for these sensual pleasures.
So it's not just suppressing desire.
No, it's more fundamental. It's about eradicating that craving at its root.
And the Buddha then brings us back to the initial question from those ascetics, right? Emphasizing that only those who truly understand this whole interplay, the allure, the drawbacks, the liberation, can genuinely claim to have insight and guide others. It's not enough to just repeat the words. You have to have a deep, maybe experiential understanding of the nature of these experiences.
Exactly. It's a call for a profound and personal awakening, not just an intellectual agreement with a set of ideas.
Okay, let's move on to the second category the Buddha mentions, forms, or rupa. What does he say about what attracts us to forms? It feels a bit different from those immediate sensory pleasures, doesn't it?
It does seem a bit different. The allure of forms, or rupa, is illustrated through a specific example. A beautiful young woman. She's described as being around 15 or 16, possessing what are considered balanced and pleasing features. The Buddha states that such a sight is indeed regarded as beautiful,
Right.
and that the pleasure and joy that arise from appreciating this beauty constitute the allure of form. It's that aesthetic appreciation, the visual harmony that we find appealing.
So it's not just the raw physical sensation, maybe, but the perception of beauty, the visual order and symmetry.
That seems to be the idea here.
Yeah.
Now, what about the drawbacks of forms? The Buddha uses a rather striking and, frankly, somewhat unsettling continuation of this example, doesn't he?
He really does. He revisits the image of this beautiful young woman, but takes it through the inevitable stages of aging.
Also.
She becomes old, 80, 90, or 100 years old, frail, hunched over, needing a stick for support, trembling. Her youthful beauty completely gone, replaced by the undeniable realities of physical decline. Broken teeth, gray and thinning hair, wrinkled skin, age spots. It's a stark reminder of how transient physical beauty is.
It's a really direct contrast, isn't it? Highlighting the impermanent nature of physical attractiveness. What we find so appealing inevitably fades and deteriorates.
And the Buddha doesn't stop there, does he? The description continues.
No, he continues to trace the drawbacks through the experience of sickness, showing the same person, once considered beautiful, now lying ill and suffering, maybe even in her own bodily waste, needing help just to move.
Yeah.
Her former beauty is now completely overshadowed by the harsh realities of illness and dependence. It's a very visceral image of the body's vulnerability.
Indeed. And then comes the inevitable death. The Buddha describes the decay of the corpse, left in a charnel ground.
What does he say happens?
It starts to swell, turn blue, and begin to fester after just a day or two. That's a pretty blunt way to make the point about form.
It is, but it's intended as a powerful illustration of the body's ultimate fate, isn't it?
Yeah.
Any allure it held is quickly replaced by something inherently repulsive.
It's a forceful way to try and break down our attachments to the physical form.
And the Buddha further emphasizes this by detailing the stages of decomposition, describing the corpse being consumed by various scavengers.
Like what?
Crows, vultures, hawks, dogs, jackals, various worms and creatures. The visual appeal is utterly destroyed, replaced by a scene of decay and consumption.
Each step seems designed to further strip away any trace of that initial allure, that beauty.
And finally, he describes the skeletal remains. First, with remnants of flesh and blood still clinging, held together by tendons.
Oh, okay.
Then a skeleton devoid of flesh but maybe still stained with blood and held together by those tendons. And then ultimately just the clean bones held together by tendons.
Each stage highlighting the progressive breakdown of what we perceive as a stable and beautiful form.
And the final stage described. The bones become disarticulated, scattered in all directions. Hand bones here, foot bones there, leg bones, thigh bones, hip bones, the skull. Then they become white, like shells. Then old and broken, and finally reduced to dust. This incredibly detailed breakdown just underscores the complete impermanence and lack of any lasting essence in physical form.
So just as with sensual pleasures, the Buddha then defines liberation from forms. What does that involve? Is it similar?
Yes, the liberation from forms is described similarly. It's the removal and abandonment of craving, specifically the cessation of desire for these visual and aesthetic forms.
So it's about letting go of our attachment to beauty and physical appearance, really recognizing its fleeting nature.
That seems to be the core of it. And again, the understanding of this initial attraction, these unavoidable drawbacks, aging, sickness, decay, and the path of liberation, is presented as essential for true understanding.
You can't genuinely grasp the nature of form without confronting its impermanence and the inevitability of decay head-on.
Precisely. It requires seeing beyond the surface-level attractiveness and recognizing the inherent cycle of change and eventual dissolution.
All right, let's move on to the final category mentioned, feelings, or Vedana. Now, the allure here seems a bit more subtle, maybe. The Buddha uses the example of meditative states, often called jhanas. to illustrate this.
That's right.
Can you explain what these states are and why they're considered alluring in this context?
Yes, the Buddha describes these meditative states as examples of the allure of feelings, because they offer this profound sense of joy and pleasure that doesn't arise from sensory input, like the combo we talked about earlier.
Okay, so where does it come from?
It comes from a deep state of inner stillness and focused concentration. You can think of them as deeply absorbed, concentrated mental states. He outlines 4 of these jhanas, each characterized by increasing levels of mental tranquility and detachment. In the first jhana, there's a feeling of joy and pleasure born of solitude, detachment from both sensual pleasures and unwholesome thoughts. And it's accompanied by focused and sustained mental activity. Importantly, the text notes that in this state, there's no inclination towards harming oneself, others, or both, so it results in a feeling that is free from affliction.
Ah, okay. So the allure here isn't a fleeting sensory hit, but a deeper, more sustained sense of well-being and peace that originates from within. It's almost the opposite of seeking pleasure in external things.
Exactly. Then the second jhana involves a stilling of that initial mental activity, leading to a deeper inner confidence and a unified state of mind.
And what's the feeling like there?
It's characterized by joy and pleasure born of this intense concentration, but without that initial level of thought. And again, this brings a feeling free from affliction.
So a further refinement, a deepening of that inner peace and focus.
Right. Then the third jhana sees a fading of that intense joy, replaced by a state of equanimity, a balanced, even-minded awareness,
Okay.
coupled with mindfulness and clear understanding, yet still accompanied by a subtle feeling of pleasure in both body and mind. And this also leads to a feeling free from affliction.
So even as the more active elements of joy subside, a more subtle and balanced pleasure remains, rooted in that inner equilibrium. Interesting.
And finally, the fourth jhana involves the complete abandoning of both pleasure and pain, and the prior disappearance of both joy and displeasure. One enters a state of neither pleasure nor pain, purified by a profound sense of equanimity and mindfulness.
And that, too, is free from affliction.
That, too, is described as a feeling free from affliction.
So the allure of feelings, in this specific context of the jhanas, is this progressive journey towards deeper and more refined states of mental peace, a kind of liberation from the usual ups and downs of emotional experience.
Yes, it's about finding a profound sense of well-being that's not dependent on external factors.
And how does the Buddha summarize that allure?
He summarizes the allure of feelings in this context as, and this is a direct quote, the feeling that has the absence of affliction as its final end.
That inherent peace and freedom from suffering found within these concentrated states of mind. Now, what about the drawbacks of feelings? Even these seemingly positive and deeply peaceful meditative states must have some inherent limitations, according to the text, right? Otherwise, they'd be the final goal.
Yes, that's a key point. The fundamental drawback of all feelings, even these refined meditative ones, is that they are impermanent. They're inherently unsatisfactory, or dukkha, and they are subject to change.
So even the jhanas aren't permanent.
Exactly. Even the profound and pleasant feelings arising from jhana are not permanent conditions. They arise, they persist for a time, and eventually they pass away. This inherent instability, their transient nature, is identified as their drawback.
So even the deepest state of meditative bliss is still within the realm of impermanence and therefore ultimately not a final or lasting solution in itself.
That's the teaching here, yes.
And how does the Buddha define liberation from feelings then? Does it follow the pattern?
It does. The liberation from feelings, mirroring the others, is the removal and abandonment of craving, specifically the cessation of desire for all feelings, even those seemingly positive ones, experienced in meditation.
So it's about not clinging even to these refined states of consciousness.
Yes, because even those can become a subtle form of attachment, potentially hindering true and complete liberation.
And once again, the Buddha emphasizes the crucial need for a genuine understanding of this whole package. The allure, the inherent changeability and potential for dissatisfaction, and the path to liberation.
Exactly. It's not enough to simply experience pleasant or profound feelings. True understanding requires recognizing their impermanent nature and letting go of any attachment to them, however seemingly beneficial they might feel at the time.
The text then concludes with the monks joyfully receiving the Buddha's teaching.
Yes.
And a resounding sadhu, 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 which, as we noted earlier, seems to be a very enthusiastic, well said, or excellent.
Indeed. It signifies their deep appreciation and presumably their newfound clarity regarding the Buddha's profound explanation of these differences.
So, to sort of bring our deep dive to a close here, today we've explored this really fascinating ancient dialogue that underscores the vital importance of understanding the allure, the inherent drawbacks, and the path to liberation
Hmm.
from sensual pleasures, forms, and feelings. The text makes it powerfully clear that simply sharing similar goals or having superficial understandings isn't sufficient.
No, not without a deep and nuanced comprehension of these fundamental aspects of our human experience. It's about depth, not just surface similarity.
Yeah. And this exploration, I think, offers a really valuable framework, maybe, for analyzing not only our own experiences, but also the various teachings and philosophies we might encounter out there.
Definitely. By understanding the temporary nature of joys, the inherent limitations within them, and the path towards a more lasting freedom as described here, you can potentially gain a much deeper and more practical insight into yourself and the world around you.
And it really makes you think, doesn't it? Maybe consider taking this ancient framework, allure, drawback, and liberation, and just applying it, maybe experimentally, to other areas of your life, beyond just these three categories.
Like what?
Well, what other experiences or pursuits or even beliefs might you examine through this lens? Just to see if it helps you gain a deeper understanding of their true nature and maybe their potential for lasting fulfillment.
That's an interesting thought, applying that three-part analysis more broadly.
Yeah, just a thought to leave you with.